The storm came in 20 minutes. Calm seas suddenly turned into 12-foot swells. GPS signal vanished, radio filled with static. While 8 tourists panicked, Captain Joe quietly took command. And what he did during the next 3 hours was a display of seamanship none of them would ever forget. Classic navigation, storm tactics, perfect vessel control. But how? Joe was just a fishing tour guide, wasn't he? Welcome to Human Stories. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden naval expertise, maritime mastery, and the admirals who continue serving in ways we never expect, tell me in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button. Some heroes command fleets, others command fishing boats, but they never stop commanding. The small marina in Starfish Bay, Maine, was home to dozens of fishing vessels, lobster boats, and tourist charter operations. Among them, Captain Joe's fishing adventures was neither the largest nor the flashiest, just a well-maintained 38-foot sport fishing boat called Second Wind, operated by a friendly man who seemed to genuinely love sharing his passion for fishing. Joe Harrison, 62 years old, had been running fishing tours for 12 years. He was the kind of captain tourists loved, patient with beginners, knowledgeable about local waters, and full of stories that made the day memorable whether the fish were biting or not. His office was a small shed on the dock decorated with photos of happy customers holding their catches, local navigation charts, and a few old maritime photographs that could have been from any sailing background. Nothing suggested military service, nothing hinted at anything beyond a lifetime love of fishing and the sea. Regular customers appreciated Joe's calm competence and safety-first approach. He never took unnecessary risks, always checked weather conditions carefully, and had an uncanny ability to find fish when other captains came back empty-handed. That Tuesday in late September started as one of those perfect New England fishing days. Clear skies, light winds, water temperature ideal for late-season striped bass. Joe had a group of 8 tourists, a family from Boston, 2 couples from New York, and a businessman from Connecticut who was treating clients to a day on the water. The group met at the marina at 7 a.m. for what was supposed to be an 8-hour offshore fishing trip. Joe conducted his usual safety briefing, checked that everyone had properly fitting life jackets, and explained the day's plan. "We'll head about 15 miles offshore to some productive ledges," Joe explained. "Weather looks perfect, seas are calm, and the fish have been cooperative lately." The early part of the trip went exactly as planned. They reached the fishing grounds by 8:30, and within an hour, everyone had caught fish. The mood was celebratory, the boat was filled with laughter, and Joe was doing what he did best, making sure everyone had a great time on the water. By noon, they had enough fish for everyone to take home a good meal, and Joe suggested moving to a different area for the afternoon session. That's when everything changed. Joe had been watching the horizon with the kind of attention that comes from decades at sea. The morning's clear skies were developing an ominous quality, the kind of atmospheric change that experienced mariners learn to recognize instinctively. "Folks," Joe announced around 1 p.m., "I think we should start heading back. Weather's looking like it might turn ugly." The tourists looked around, confused. The sun was still shining, the water was still relatively calm, and their weather apps showed nothing concerning. "Looks fine to us, Captain," said Mark, the businessman from Connecticut. "We paid for a full day." Joe didn't argue, but he began preparing the boat in ways the tourists didn't notice, securing loose equipment, checking emergency gear, plotting multiple courses back to port. 20 minutes later, the weather proved Joe right, spectacularly and dangerously. Chapter 4. Storm Onset. The storm system that hit them came with the sudden violence that the North Atlantic is famous for. In less than 20 minutes, winds went from 10 knots to 45 knots, seas built from 2 feet to 12 feet, and visibility dropped from clear to nearly zero as rain and spray filled the air. The tourists went from enjoying a pleasant fishing trip to experiencing genuine terror. The boat was being tossed like a toy, water was coming over the sides, and the horizon had disappeared completely. "Oh my God," screamed Sarah from Boston, "are we going to die?" That's when Joe transformed. Gone was the friendly fishing guide. In his place was someone with absolute authority and unshakable calm. His voice cut through the wind and panic with the kind of command presence that made everyone automatically listen. "Everyone listen to me," Joe commanded. "We're going to be fine, but I need you to do exactly what I say, when I say it." Joe's first action was to get everyone properly positioned and secured, not the casual safety measures of a pleasure cruise, but the kind of systematic crew management that keeps ships operational in extreme conditions. "Mark, you're going to help me with navigation. Sarah, I need you to monitor the radio. Everyone else, center of the boat, hold on and watch for my signals." As Joe worked, it became clear that this wasn't improvised emergency response. This was practiced command under pressure. When the GPS failed due to antenna damage, Joe didn't panic. He pulled out a compass and began plotting their position, using techniques that most recreational boaters had never seen. When the main radio malfunctioned, Joe switched to backup systems and began transmitting on frequencies the tourists didn't know existed. And when the boat's engines began straining against the massive seas, Joe adjusted course and power settings with the precision of someone who had navigated much larger vessels through much worse weather. With modern electronics failing, Joe reverted to navigation methods that amazed his passengers. He was reading wave patterns, interpreting wind direction changes, and calculating position using techniques that seemed like maritime magic. "How do you know where we are?" Mark asked, watching Joe work with the compass and chart. "Dead reckoning, pilotage, and 40 years of experience," Joe replied without looking up from his calculations. But it was more than experience. Joe was applying navigation principles with a precision that suggested formal training far beyond civilian boating courses. He estimated their drift, calculated set and speed made good, and projected multiple courses of action based on changing weather conditions, the kind of comprehensive navigation planning used by naval officers, not fishing guides. As the storm intensified, Joe began employing vessel handling techniques that went far beyond normal seamanship. He was running the boat at specific angles to the waves, timing acceleration and deceleration to minimize stress on the hull, and maintaining course stability using methods the tourists had never seen. "This isn't normal boat handling," observed Lisa, one of the New York tourists who happened to be a sailing instructor. "This is military-level seamanship." Joe heard her comment but didn't respond. He was too focused on what naval officers call fighting the ship, using every available resource and technique to keep his vessel and crew safe in extreme conditions. When a particularly large wave threatened to broach the boat, Joe's response was immediate and perfect, adjusting course, power, and trim with split-second timing that prevented disaster. The tourists realized they weren't just with an experienced fishing captain. They were with someone who had commanded vessels in conditions far worse than this. When Joe finally established radio contact with the Coast Guard, his communication style revealed another layer of his background. "Coast Guard Station Gloucester, this is motor vessel Second Wind, Whiskey Delta November 4321. Position approximately 15 miles east-southeast of Starfish Bay. 8 souls on board, vessel operational, no immediate distress but requesting weather updates and traffic advisory for return transit." The radio discipline, proper terminology, and systematic information exchange were clearly military trained. The Coast Guard operator responded with equal professionalism. "Second Wind, Coast Guard Gloucester. Copy 8 souls on board, no distress. Be advised, weather deteriorating. Recommend immediate return to port. Are you able to make way?" "Affirmative, Coast Guard. Estimate arrival Starfish Bay in 2 hours. Will maintain radio contact." The tourists listened to this exchange with growing awareness that their captain was someone very different from who they'd thought. Joe's navigation back to port in zero visibility was a masterclass in traditional seamanship. Without GPS, relying on compass, chart, and intuition, he guided them through dangerous waters with confidence that could only come from years of similar challenges. He was calling out navigation updates. "Coming left to course 285, estimate 8 miles to harbor entrance. Watch for lobster pot markers off the starboard bow." Everything he predicted proved accurate. Distances, timing, hazards. Joe's mental navigation was flawless. As they approached the harbor entrance, visibility began to improve slightly. The tourists could see other boats that had been caught in the storm limping back to port, some clearly in distress, others being assisted by Coast Guard vessels. But Second Wind arrived under her own power, crew safe, with a captain who had managed the crisis with skills that clearly went far beyond recreational fishing. When they finally tied up at the dock, the tourists sat quietly for several minutes, processing what they had experienced. What had started as a pleasure fishing trip had become a demonstration of seamanship that none of them had ever witnessed. "Joe," asked Mark, the businessman from Connecticut, "where did you learn to handle a boat like that?" Joe was securing dock lines and seemed reluctant to answer. "Different boats, different waters?" "That wasn't recreational boating," pressed Lisa, the sailing instructor. "That was naval-level ship handling." Joe paused in his work and looked at the group of people he'd just brought safely through a life-threatening storm. "Navy," he said quietly. "Long time ago." The simple admission changed everything. Suddenly, the calm command, the perfect navigation, the storm tactics, the radio discipline, it all made sense. Over the next hour, as they waited out the storm in Joe's marina office, the tourists gradually learned who their fishing guide really was. Rear Admiral Joseph Harrison, U.S. Navy retired. 35 years of naval service, commander of destroyer squadrons, aircraft carrier battle groups, and ultimately an entire fleet. "I commanded ships through hurricanes in the Pacific, North Atlantic storms that made today look calm, and combat situations where navigation errors meant people died," Joe explained. "So why are you running fishing tours?" asked Sarah. Joe looked out at the harbor, where boats were still struggling to return safely. "Because I love the sea. I love teaching people about it. And after 35 years of command responsibility, I wanted to do something where the biggest concern was whether people caught fish." But the tourists understood now that even in retirement, Joe had never stopped being a commander. He'd just found a different way to keep people safe on the water. Word of Joe's expert handling of the storm spread quickly through the marina and fishing community. Other boat captains who had struggled through the same weather were impressed by reports of Second Wind's smooth return. "That was textbook heavy weather seamanship," commented Captain Mike Sullivan, who ran a larger charter operation. "I've been fishing these waters for 20 years, and I've never seen anyone handle conditions like that with such precision." The local harbor master, himself a former Coast Guard officer, was particularly interested in Joe's navigation techniques. "Dead reckoning and zero visibility with that level of accuracy? That's Naval Academy level training." Joe found himself uncomfortable with the attention. He'd spent 12 years building a quiet civilian life, and having his military background revealed felt like stepping back into a world he'd left behind. Within a week, Joe started receiving requests from other boat operators who wanted to learn his storm tactics and navigation techniques. Young fishing guides, charter captains, even Coast Guard auxiliarists asked if he would consider teaching advanced seamanship courses. "There's a big difference between knowing how to operate a boat in good weather and knowing how to command a vessel in a crisis," explained Tom Rodriguez, a lobsterman who'd heard about Joe's storm handling. "We need to learn what you know." Joe was initially reluctant, but the argument was compelling. If his knowledge could help other mariners stay safe and bring their passengers home, didn't he have a responsibility to share it? He began offering monthly seamanship seminars at the marina, teaching navigation techniques, storm tactics, and emergency response procedures that weren't available in standard boating courses. Joe's seminars caught the attention of the local Coast Guard station. Commander Sarah Patterson, the commanding officer, asked to meet with him. "Admiral," she said, using his retired rank, "we've heard about your training program. The Coast Guard is always looking for qualified instructors for our auxiliary and reserve programs." "I'm not looking to get back into uniform," Joe replied. "You don't need a uniform to save lives. You proved that last week. But we could use your expertise in training our people and educating the civilian boating community." Commander Patterson explained that many recreational boaters lacked the skills needed for emergency situations, and that Joe's military-level training could fill a critical gap in maritime safety education. Joe eventually agreed to develop a Coast Guard-sponsored advanced seamanship program. The curriculum combined traditional navigation techniques with modern technology, emphasizing the skills needed when electronics fail and conditions become life-threatening. The goal, Joe explained to his first official class, isn't to turn recreational boaters into naval officers. It's to give you the tools to stay calm and think clearly when everything goes wrong. His students included charter captains, commercial fishermen, sailing instructors, and serious recreational boaters who understood that the ocean demanded respect and preparation. The program became popular throughout New England, and Joe found himself traveling to different ports to teach courses. But he always returned to Starfish Bay and his fishing tours, maintaining the civilian life he'd built while sharing the expertise that could save lives. 2 years after the storm that revealed his background, Joe was conducting a routine fishing trip when they encountered another boat in distress, a family whose engine had failed in rough weather. Without hesitation, Joe maneuvered second wind alongside the disabled vessel and coordinated a complex transfer operation that brought the family safely aboard. His passengers, who knew his background, watched with appreciation as Joe demonstrated the same calm competence that had saved them years earlier. "It never stops, does it?" asked one passenger. "The responsibility to help when people are in trouble." "No," Joe replied, watching the disabled boat being towed to safety by the Coast Guard. "It doesn't, but that's not a burden. It's a privilege." Joe continued running Captain Joe's fishing adventures, but his role had expanded far beyond tourism. He'd become a resource for the entire maritime community, teaching skills that bridged the gap between recreational boating and professional seamanship. The marina where he operated became an informal training center for advanced boat handling, and students came from across New England to learn from the retired admiral who'd chosen to share his expertise rather than simply enjoy retirement. "Some people think military skills don't translate to civilian life," Joe told a group of Coast Guard reservists during one training session. "But leadership, navigation, emergency response, these skills are universal. The only difference is the uniform you wear while using them." 5 years after his background was revealed, Joe received a letter from Mark, the businessman whose fishing trip had turned into a storm survival experience. "Admiral," the letter read, "I wanted you to know that I've been taking sailing lessons ever since our trip. You showed me that understanding the sea isn't just about recreation. It's about respecting something larger than ourselves and being prepared for its challenges. Thank you for keeping us safe and for showing us what real leadership looks like." Joe kept the letter in his office, along with similar notes from students, fellow mariners, and Coast Guard personnel who had benefited from his training. He'd spent 35 years commanding ships and sailors in the U.S. Navy. Now he was spending his retirement commanding fishing boats and teaching civilian mariners. The vessels were smaller, the stakes were different, but the mission remained the same: keeping people safe on the water. Conclusion: some admirals retire to golf courses and speaking circuits. Others, like Rear Admiral Joseph Harrison, choose to keep serving in ways that matter most to them. For 12 years, Joe ran simple fishing tours, sharing his love of the sea with tourists who just wanted to catch fish and enjoy a day on the water. But when that September storm tested everyone aboard second wind, Joe revealed that he was more than a fishing guide. He was one of the Navy's most experienced ship commanders, still protecting people at sea. The storm that could have been a tragedy became a demonstration of what happens when naval expertise meets civilian need. 8 tourists went home with more than fish stories. They went home having witnessed seamanship at its highest level, performed by someone who had never stopped serving his community. Joe's story spread because it reminded people that extraordinary capabilities often hide behind ordinary appearances. The friendly fishing guide, the helpful neighbor, the quiet community member. Any of them might be former military officers whose skills could save your life. Have you ever discovered that someone in your community had expertise far beyond what their current role suggested? Someone whose hidden background became apparent only in a moment of crisis? Tell us their story in the comments. Because at Human Stories, we believe that veterans continue serving long after they leave active duty, and they deserve recognition for the ways they keep us safe every single day. Subscribe if stories like this matter to you, because every harbor has former naval officers like Joe Harrison, men and women who chose to use their hard-earned expertise to protect and serve in ways that rarely make headlines. But